Hello, my name's Mick Child, Director of Forge Photography Limited, and welcome to day 2 of the Alliance Photography Club's tutorials. Well, it's great to be back on day 2 of our tutorials. And today we're going to be looking at AV settings on our camera. So what we're going to be doing in a bit, and you can do this if you want, if you've got your camera at the ready, is adjust your camera setting to AV. Today we'll look into what AV is and how we can control the aperture with that and what the aperture does. So I've had some emails from you over the last couple of days, and I've got one lined up here. This is from Ed Ward. Thank you, Ed, for writing in. Mick, loving the tutorial. Well, what can I say? Thank you, Ed. He says, what is the most difficult photography that you do? Well, every type of photography is quite challenging, whether you're going to do landscape, whether you're taking pictures of models, you know, getting the lighting right, getting the colors right, getting everything right is quite difficult, you know. But the most challenging photography for me, I would suggest, is macro photography. Macro photography is where we're capturing images close up. So it might be of a flower, it might be of a bicycle wheel tire, it might be of an insect or whatever it is. But what macro is, it's actually getting up really close to the subject and taking a photo. So there are 2 types of lenses that I use for macro photography. If I grab this one over here, this is a Canon macro lens. This is an interesting one. This is a 100mm lens. The second thing is, I also own something called an extension tube. This is quite an interesting piece of kit. Okay, this extension tube actually fits onto this lens, like so. So I've now got my lens and I've now got an extension tube on it. What this extension tube does, it actually moves the lens further away from the sensor of the camera. And what that allows me to do, that 300mm that I have to be from the subject, I can now reduce that right down so I can get in really close and still be in focus. Now, one of the issues with macro photography, you know, especially when you're using a lens that's nearly £1,000 and you don't want to scratch, remember I said to you, you don't want to scratch this, this glass. So what we do is we normally put the lens hood on, okay? But with macro photography, lens hoods are not good. Okay, they're not good because actually I can't get any closer than that. Look, the end of that. What I want to do is be able to get in really close to my subject. So I can't go with the lens hood. So what I do, I tend to buy sort of more expensive UV filters. Okay, these go onto the end of they just screw onto the end of the lens. Okay, that might cost me £30 to buy. You can buy them cheaper, you can buy them more expensive, all right? But it's a sacrificial cover for my lens, so that when I'm in close, taking pictures of things close, flowers, roses, spiky things, the worst I'm going to do is scratch my filter. I'm not going to scratch my lens, which would mean that I've broken my lens and I need to get another one. I have another type of lens that I use for macro photography, and I also use this other lens for video work as well. This is the type of lens that you might see on Blue Planet. I'm going to take this lead out, because I'm going to need to show you this lead. I'm going to have to hold on to my box as I take this out because the box always tips over. Whoop, there we go. Okay, so this is what's called a macro tube, okay? This lens here works fully automatically on the focus on top of my camera. When it's on my camera, it focuses fully auto. This lens is a manual focus, okay? It has 2 controls on it, really. It has an aperture setting. So remember, yesterday we're going to be talking about AV a little bit today and how that works. But aperture basically opens and closes the hole in the lens. So that controls how much light is coming through onto your sensor, okay? The second control here is my focus. So as we come in closer to a subject, we need to focus, and as we come away, we need to focus. So obviously that focal distance is getting different all the time, so we have to focus. So you have to work a little bit harder with this lens, but it's a very satisfying lens to work with. Now the reason that it's very satisfying to work with, I mean, look at the difference between the 2 lenses, okay? There's a big difference there. Well, one thing is that this one is a lot better in quality, okay? The pictures and the colors that I get off this lens, which is made by Canon, are much better than the pictures I get off this lens. However, With this type of macro lens, when I take a shot, it tends to isolate the subject. If I was taking the picture of an eye of a very small fly, we'll have the eye in focus, but everything else will be fairly out of focus, and you can see that on some of the photos that we're running through and showing you here. With this one has pieces of glass all the way through it. It's a very clever piece of engineering, this, and it was engineered, I believe, by videographers who were wanting to get close-ups of insects and animals. One of the things with a macro lens is that we have to work with a fairly small aperture, okay? So the hole inside the lens has to be fairly small. And the reason that we do that is that we want lots of depth of, what we call depth of field, okay? We don't want to really isolate the image completely. We want to give the viewer a bit of feeling about what was going on behind it, you know? Now the wonderful thing about this lens, and I'm not a macro photographer that likes to take pictures in a tank or in a, you know, in a setup stage. I like to be out there, and I like to actually be out taking pictures of things in nature. So one of the issues that we have by having a very small aperture, if you can imagine, the bigger the hole is in the lens, the more light that we can let in. So as you start to decrease the size of the hole in the lens, suddenly we can't get as much light in, okay? So what we can do is we can compensate using something called ISO on the camera, and we can compensate by slowing down the shutter speed. So if the shutter's open for longer, for instance, there's more time for the light to come in. The disadvantage of that is that if you haven't got it on a tripod or your subject moves very quickly, you get a blurred image. Okay, so we don't really want to slow, when we're doing macro photography of insects and things like that, we don't want to slow the shutter speed down so slow that actually we just get a blurred image of the ant or whatever it is running away. So what they did with this lens was they added a feature of LED lights around the top. These LED lights in themselves are not the only answer to, there we go, I've got that in. Right, they're not the only answer to giving you enough light. You need background light as well, lots and lots of it. So, you know, we'll use lots of spotlights with us when we take this with us, or we'll shoot in bright sunlight and with this light on. Now, the way we work with this light is normally I'll put some sort of belt connection clip on, and this is just one of those chargers for a phone. So I literally, I just plug this supply in. That's switched on automatically, and then we switch our light on, he says, hopefully. There we go, so there's our light. I don't know how well you can see that. I don't want to blind you. Okay, so now I can get a picture. As I say, depth of field is wonderful. Depth of field with this lens is absolutely incredible, and here's some photos that I've taken. The disadvantage with the way this lens is made, and you'll see it in my photos that I'm showing you now compared to this, is really the colours, the colour range. The colour range on this lens is much more limited than this nice lens here. Although, as you can see, I'm getting much more depth of field with this lens. We can set the apertures pretty much the same. This one goes down to 40, so that's a very, very small aperture, and it starts at 14, f14. We'll talk about those another day. Let's put this back in the box for now so it's out of the way. Okay, so by the power of editing tools, everything's now packed away. You didn't have to suffer me doing that. And my phone's ringing. Izzy, what's the matter?
There's these spiders.
Okay, sweetheart, I'm filming. Look, Izzy has a spider in a tent, so I'm not quite sure what she's going to do about that, Izzy. Say hello, wave to everybody at school and all the people around the world watching.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, okay, she's gone.
Daddy, help me. Can you tell George to hurry up and get me?
I think you need to go and get him. Okay, right, that's Isabel. Yes, everybody, that was Isabel. Right, I do apologise for that. Right, I've picked my camera up again. We're going to look at AV. Okay, before we get to AV, there's another setting that you need to learn on your camera, and that's the ISO setting, okay? Now, it's different on every, well, on every maker camera, there's probably a different way to set it up. Canons, I know. The button will be on the top here somewhere, and it will say ISO. Okay, we push that and then we can adjust the ISO. What I'd like you to learn to do between now and on Tuesday when we go out and take some photos is that I would like you to set your ISO to auto, to automatic, okay? If you can find out how to do that, that would be great. The second thing you need to do then is normally on the dial, but your bridge camera or whatever might not have this dial. You might do it on the menu, on the back, I don't know. But certainly most cameras will have a dial that have got AV or A for aperture written on them. Set this dial to A, okay? So we've got auto ISO set and we've got the dial set to A. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the controls. Now on this camera, when we're in a semi-manual mode like AV, aperture priority, it means all that we can control is the aperture. Okay, what the camera will sort out for you is the shutter speed that you need. Okay, and because we've selected auto ISO, it will also sort out for the best picture that we want to that it can take for you. It will also sort out the amount of sensitivity you need on your sensor automatically without you even having to think about that. You heard me talking about light being important in yesterday's tutorial, and light is really, really important to us. If you've got a large aperture, obviously, the bigger the hole in your lens, the more light that's going to come through onto your sensor. It goes without saying that if we reduce the size of that hole, then less light's going to go onto the sensor. So, what does aperture do apart from lets more light in or not? Because you're probably thinking, well, why don't we just have, the aperture wide open and then we've never got a problem? When we've got the aperture wide open, we affect what we call depth of field. Now, I'm not going to get too technical with this, okay? I'm not going to talk about other things that you might get when you change the size of your aperture, okay? But if it's wide open, your depth of field's going to be very shallow. When I say a depth of field, I'm talking about other things that are in focus and have got clarity within your image. So, for instance, if you take your camera now and you focus your eye on the lens, you will see, if you're looking at that lens, that everything behind it has now gone fuzzy. Now, if you do the opposite thing with your eye and you look behind the lens at the wall of your room, you will notice now that you can see the wall of the room, but actually the lens has gone fuzzy. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about depth of field. The problem with the way this all works and the technical side of it, which we're not going to go too much into, is that aperture, in other words, the hole in your lens, the size of it, is described as a number, as an f-stop, okay? So, the problem is, the bigger the hole, the smaller the f-stop number. It works in reverse, okay? So, on most cameras, the widest aperture that you might get might be something like f5.6. If you've got AV set now, okay, if you switch your camera on, you've got auto ISO set. If you turn the dial, normally the dial on the top, but please, all cameras are different. This is a Canon, so this dial on the top is the one that I turn to dial up and down the aperture. You'll see that you can set your aperture hopefully to 5.6, okay, using that dial. That's a very wide aperture. Now what I'll say to you is, okay, so first of all, here's a photo with a shallow depth of field, and this one's probably taken on f2.8, although I don't know for sure, okay, but you can see that the subject is pretty much isolated. So by widening up that hole, by having a very large aperture, a small f-stop number, we can actually isolate the subject. If I was taking a landscape picture, I might want to have a lot more in focus. In fact, the chances are that I do want quite a lot in focus. So if you change this dial on the top here, we can make the hole smaller by dialing in a larger number. Hey, that's where it gets confusing. So we're going to make the aperture smaller by dialing in a larger number. Now, the sweet spot for most of my lenses is around about f-stop 16, okay? It's a fairly small aperture. Here's a picture here that I've took on something between f11 and f16. And you can see with this picture that I've got an awful lot more detail, okay, in the picture overall. So where we were looking at that lens there, I'm now being able to see things behind the lens towards the wall, okay? I can now see a lot more. And that's what depth of field is, and that's what we're controlling with AV. It's been great talking to you today. Really looking forward to getting outside and actually doing some practical work on Tuesday. Have your cameras, have a play, try different f-stops. Go and have a play now. Go and try it around your garden. Give it a go. You know, it doesn't hurt to have a go. This is all about experimenting and trying it out. Do make sure though that you've got your autofocus set, okay? so that when you're focusing on things, your camera's actually doing the focusing. If there's anything that I've talked about that you don't understand, that you need for Tuesday, make sure you drop me an email and we'll try and put it at the front of the show, okay? So, forgephotography.lessons@gmail.com, forgephotography.lessons@gmail.com. Don't forget to press subscribe, okay? Get that bell pushed as well on YouTube so that you get a notification when we put the next lesson up. And I look forward to seeing you Tuesday. Yay, happy snapping!